Welcome back guys to another video on Canadian Desi, and first of all my sincere apologies for being away for such a long time. I was actually having some emergencies going on for the past few weeks, and I recently moved closer to downtown Toronto, which took even more time. So my deep apologies to all of you guys. And yes, I know I haven't been able to reply to a lot of your comments since then, but hopefully I will catch up on it, and I hope most of you must have already got your answers to your questions. Now let's get back to the topic of today's video, and that is visitor visa, which a lot of you guys are still very much confused about. Remember my previous videos where I talked about how you can apply for a visitor visa rather than applying and waiting for a permanent residency, and how you can maximize the efficiency of your results? Guess what? It's still possible, and I made it happen once again. This time from a brother who recently got a successful visitor visa for Canada. I applied for his visa in the middle of November last year, and within a time span of 3 months, he was here. I applied for his visa under the same new online portal that I talked about in this video that was introduced by the government in September 7 last year. And to my surprise, this portal really works. Basically, for all the people wondering, will their spouse ever get approved for a visa or not? This video will be the answer to all your questions. Basically, if all the documents and proofs are valid and legal in its existence, then there is nothing in this world that can stop your application from getting approved. Also, you must have noticed that a sibling comes under the extended family member category, and getting a visa approval for these members is most of the time harder than getting an approval for an immediate family member, that is your parents as well as your spouse. It is because an extended family member, it is always harder to prove their relationship with their Canadian sibling as opposed to a spouse, who always have ample of proofs available to prove their relationship with their spouse living in Canada. So rest assured, all the people who have second thoughts on whether anybody even gets an approval can go stress-free and apply for a visitor visa for their spouses, because if the application is good and convincing, you will get the visa. Now without further ado, let's get started and talk about how I was able to call my younger brother on a visitor visa with the help of all the knowledge and experience I have in this field, and with only a minimum charge of $185, where $100 is the application fee and $85 being the biometric fee, along with a little bit of help from my immigration lawyer. So just what I talked about in my last video, the most important thing that you have to put your focus on is how to show your family members ties to their home country. This is one of the most basic aspects that a lot of people don't understand, that leads to their rejection, but it can also turn out to be the very obvious reason that could lead to your application's approval right in your first application. These ties have to be as strong as you can show, and some basic things that help you show the strong ties are your family members' job back home, property that they own back home, their length of stay in Canada, the responsibilities towards other members of the family that live with them back home, and sufficient funds to support them for their stay in Canada. Before we go ahead and talk in detail about all these ways of showing strong ties to your home country, I also wanted to share a better truth that is currently prevalent in the immigration system in Canada. And it is that when you're applying for a visitor visa for an immediate family member, like your spouse, dependent child, or parents, the chances of rejection of these members, especially spouses, is relatively high, because a spouse of a Canadian citizen or a PR always tends to have a high tendency of staying back for longer than their intended duration of stay. And the reason is, we all know spouses. Why would a Canadian want her spouse to go back after a couple months of stay when he knows he could do something to hold them back in Canada? And this is where the whole rejection scenario comes into the picture, which is why it is very, very important for a spouse aspiring for a visa to double their focus on how they can prove their ties to their home country, because if they fail to do so, the application becomes pretty much clear to the immigration officer that their main purpose is to reunite and not just a family visit. Comparatively, if I talk about my younger brother, who is considered my extended family member, is clearly not required to show as many proofs as it is required from the spouse, because he got his own job, his own problems, his own responsibilities to take care of back home, which clearly indicates his purpose of visiting Canada for a simple family visit. And please note, this is my own independent way of looking at the scenario. Clearly, there must be a lot of spouses getting their visitor visa approved, while extended family members like my brother getting rejected, but I still believe most of the spouses tend to go through harder routes in comparison to siblings and other extended and immediate family members. But let's forget about this topic on which family member has higher chances of approval than the other, because it is just my way of predicting the outcome. And since I'm not an RCC representative, you can disregard everything I just said and mainly focus on how you can show strong ties to the home country, irrespective of which family member is applying. So let's get started. And just a side note, the proofs that I will be talking about in this video are not the only proofs that you will need in your application. These proofs are just the means to show your ties to your home country that will strengthen your application and ultimately lead to approval. All right, now let's get started. The first is job back home. The reason I kept it on the top is because your employment status back home can ultimately decide the fate of your application. Talking about my brother, he is currently a full-time employee back home with all the necessary proofs like the pay slips, income tax returns, signed employment letter, and the bank statements where he received his pay. There are many other employment proofs that you can think of to support your employment, so you don't have to just keep yourself limited to these 4 proofs. Also, make sure, if possible, you have vacation approval in writing from employer stating the days of your leave and when you intend to join back your work. Try to plan your vacation of no more than 2 months, because if more than that, then things start getting weird. For self-employed people back home, make sure you submit the same proofs that basically support your income. For unemployed family members of Canadian citizens and PR, make sure you're looking at other aspects to show your ties back home. For example, you can show the real estate that you own back home, as well as other moral responsibilities like taking care of your elderly is also something that you can show to prove that you're not at all interested in staying back in Canada for longer than your mentioned stay. The second proof that helps support your application is any properties that you own back home. For those of you wondering what needs to be submitted, that could be your property ownership documents, any recent property tax receipt that you received, any title deeds or lease agreements that you signed up for, as well as any membership certificate if the property is in a cooperative housing society like an apartment, and basically any other proofs that shows you are the legal owner of the property that will bind you to come back to your home country. Now comes the third point that could either sail your boat across the river successfully, or you know what, and that is your length of stay in Canada. It is not a proof to show, but something that you need to be careful with. It means that when you're applying for a visitor visa, you're also required to show the amount of time that you would like to stay in Canada. And as you know, a visitor visa holder is allowed to stay for a maximum of 6 months unless they're advised otherwise by the Canada Border Services Agency when they arrive. Many people believe that they should state 6 months as their proposed length of stay on their visitor visa application. However, length of proposed stay is a very common ground for refusal. Asking for the maximum amount of time allowable to visitors in Canada is not usually viewed as reasonable by officers and makes it look more likely that the applicant would not leave on time. And ultimately that leads to a rejection. So you gotta be careful with that as well. Talking about my brother, he showed that he's only going to stay in Canada for around 40 days, and the same is mentioned in his vacation letter approved by his employer. Now, the fourth thing that can help strengthen your application is the ability to prove that you have certain responsibilities back home that only you can fulfill, that binds you to go back home after spending a certain amount of time in Canada. These responsibilities could be towards your employer, your job. It could also be your financial responsibility towards your parents or grandparents, that you're the sole earner of your family and that you're the only one responsible for their financial well-being that binds you to leave Canada. Talking about my brother, we are just 2 sons of our parents and they currently live in India. So clearly he had something to return to, that is our parents, for moral and social responsibility towards them. So make sure you have something to return to that can satisfy the immigration officer. Now comes the fifth aspect, and that is the availability of sufficient funds for your stay in Canada. Even though the Canadian citizen or PR is sponsoring their overseas family member, it is still the responsibility of the family member coming to Canada to take care of their expenses themselves related to their travel, as well as showed in the application. That would include their flight expenses as well as the expenses of their stay in Canada. I know you guys must be wondering why the applicant need to show funds when their Canadian family member is sponsoring them. But let me correct you. Even though the Canadian resident will be keeping their family member at their own residence, as well as taking care of all their expenses, the member applying for a visa is still required to show adequate funds to keep themselves secured in case things go southways. Now, the Canadian resident also provides a financial support letter for the purpose of visitor visa, but the family member is still required to show some money to further strengthen the application. That would be the bank statements showing the past 3 months transaction history and the average balance for the past 6 months, as well as any additional relevant documentation like employment letter, pay slips, proof of pension, business registration, investments, etc. That I've already talked about in my other videos. Now, these were a few of those things that you required in order to apply for a Canadian visitor visa. Now, if we talk about submitting the application itself, it could either be done by the Canadian resident or their family members themselves, or with the assistance of an accredited immigration professional to look out for any flaws in your application before you are ready to hit that submit button. Now, this is something that I've already talked about in a lot of my previous videos. A lot of people who do take the assistance of an immigration lawyer tend to make one single mistake, and that is too much relying upon. You see, the lawyers are very much knowledgeable in giving consultations on what needs to be included and what not. For example, I had 2 different types of financial support letters prepared for the application, but I wasn't sure which one will be more relevant and straightforward for the application. That is when my lawyer helped me out in it. But at the same time, we are way too much reliant on them. They end up making mistakes that could have been easily avoided by us. For example, errors in spelling or incorrect number input and all that similar stuff. These are some minute details that eventually end up making a lot of difference and segregating a properly presented application to a poorly presented application. So basically, you yourself and your hired lawyer go hand in hand for the successful results of an application. Alright guys, if you do like this video, please make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to my channel, and make sure to check out my other videos as well, where I have covered specific topics related to immigration and how you can bring your loved ones to Canada. And let me know how many of you have already applied for a visa for your spouse or your family member and waiting for a decision. Any questions you got, let me know about them in the comment section below. I'll see you again with an interesting topic on Canadian Desi. Bye-bye.